what we got. Great, thank you, Bob. Okay, Bob, why don't you finish up and then I can come in.
Okay, well then I'm gonna, let's see, okay,
And I never got my power cord. I'll be right back.
okay, very good. All
Chapter
right,
5, right?
sorry, what? No, I'm finishing up chapter 4. And what we're going to do is Jerry's going to cover chapter 5, but not tonight. Um, Normally we would have done chapter 5 next week, but next week is a testing week, so Jerry does VE testing. So actually Jerry's going to do chapter 5 2 weeks from tonight. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up chapter 4 because I didn't get all the way through that, and we're going to go through some of the questions and whatnot. Then Jerry's going to take any questions you might have on chapter 3, and then with the time left over, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start getting into rules and regs, which is actually chapter 7. But chapter 7 is like first off, it's the easiest chapter in the book. It's also the shortest chapter in the book. So since we're covering other pieces tonight, that's a perfect time to put in or to take chapter 7 because it's like it's easy stuff, it's quick, and yeah, it fits. Okay. All righty. All righty. All right. Hey, last week, we talked about propagation. We talked about how antennas mattered. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about more antennas. All right. Okay, this is just the last part the of chapter 4 that I didn't reach last week. Okay, so let's hit this. Let's hit it and get it. All right, dipoles. A dipole antenna is kind of like the standard for what's used on amateur radio. The thing is, not everyone can use a dipole, but it's a simple antenna, and if you're going to build your own antenna, it's a fairly simple antenna to build. All right, what it is it's an antenna that's a half of a wavelength long. Now remember, as the frequency increases, as frequency increases, the wavelength gets shorter. When we're down at the 80-meter band, that frequency down there is very low. It's about 3 megahertz, 3.5 megahertz. When we get up to and 80 meters, 250 or 260 feet long. When we get up to the 2 meter band, remember that's just over 6 feet, and we're up at 144 megahertz. Okay, all right. So so a dipole for 2 meters would be very short, but a dipole for 80 meters would be very, very long. But anyhow, what it is it's two equal halves of wire, usually wire. On just 1 minute, please. Just 1 minute. Sorry, you didn't need to hear me sneezing. All right. um, yeah, a dipole on 2 meters, you might actually not use wire. You might actually use tubing or a small rod. But on 80 meters, of course, you would use wire. And what you do to get a dipole is you take a full wavelength of wire, cut it in half, connect it in the middle to an insulator, and then stretch out um, stretch out the ends of both sides of the wire and get it in the air if you can. Okay. Um, they say, kind of as a
Bob,
rule.
excuse me, one clarification over there. Um, what you have is you take a half wavelength and you cut that in half. So each part of the dipole is a quarter wave.
Oh, right, right, okay. Oh yeah, I was making it a full wavelength. Hey, a full wavelength could be a great antenna, but kind of unwieldy. Anyhow, a half wavelength. So on the 80-meter band, that would not be 260 feet. It'd be more like 130. All right. To um, to estimate the length in feet um, for whatever frequency you want to use, kind of the rule of thumb is you divide the frequency in megahertz into 468. Now, Jerry has told me before that you're really better off using a larger number than 468. And I don't remember what number you said. I think it was 490. And then because it's easier to shorten an antenna than it is to lengthen an antenna.
Yeah, and antenna stretchers are very, very expensive.
Yeah. Okay. Why am I not moving? Okay, it moved, didn't it?
Yeah,
Okay. Now, when you stretch out this wire, um, you're not broadcasting off the ends of the wire. You're broadcasting broadside off the wire. So you want to keep that in mind because it determines um, how you want to orient the antenna. Like if you want to transmit north-south, then your wire antenna has got to be stretched east-west because again, you're transmitting off the broadsides of the antenna. Now here's what the antenna or the transmissions, here's how it would go. Now you notice it's probably easier first to look at the bottom figure here. And you notice that's a toroid or a donut. The radio waves transmit out, in not quite spherical fashion because again, it's not going off the ends, but it's going broadside, and it's going in all directions broadside. And oh yeah, and they say the radiation pattern looks like a donut or a bagel, which is that's a pretty apt description. Okay, now, all right, we've just talked about um, the dipole antenna. What is that I hear? Anyhow,
Wow.
anyhow, the next is what's called the ground plane, which is basically a vertical antenna. On your car, it would look like this. Here, let me stop sharing a minute. An antenna like this is something suitable for a car where you have this mag mount and that goes, sorry, this magnetic mount that goes on your roof or on your trunk, assuming your car is made of metal, and then you've got this nice vertical antenna. Now what happens is on the vertical antenna, you're transmitting out, you know, broadside to the vertical antenna. And in this case, with this antenna, this is both a 2-meter and a 440. And it can do that because of the coil in the center. Because if you're broadcasting 440, it broadcasts on one section of it. If you're broadcasting on the longer wavelength, the 2-meter, then it uses more of the antenna.
Bob, actually, the ground plane is a dipole antenna. Are you going to explain that?
Well, yeah, it is in essence a dipole antenna because, what happens is like the metal, the roof of your car, if you've got this on your car, the roof of your car acts like a reflector and it kind of takes the place of the other half of the antenna. So you've got, think of it, one half of the antenna is going up, the other half is a reflection from um, well, what we've called the ground plane. Um, Sometimes in just regular antennas that aren't going on the car, if they're verticals, you may actually have radials um, sticking out from the bottom of the base of the antenna, and that would serve the same purpose. It would serve the purpose of the ground plane and acting as the other half of the antenna because you've got just half. All right.
Can I put out an anti-commercial
Okay, go ahead.
on this? Okay, you're going to see in some of the magazines or websites, you're going to see uh, these suppliers trying to sell you $400 or $500 vertical antennas. They say no radials needed, and it's simply not true. I mean, when I was a kid, they were selling the same kind of hogwash, Gotham antennas. Uh, you you have to have something that's going to bounce off the ground. The ground itself is pretty inefficient. So a rule of thumb, this is probably beyond the pay grade of a technician class. The rule of thumb is that if you're at the ground, you have to put many of these radials, wires that are quarter wave long, in a circle around the vertical section. If you boost the antenna up so the base is I don't know 10 or 15 feet up, then you can get away with 3 or 4 radials. So that's a good thing to know. But if you're going to spend $500 on something and it says no radials needed, I don't know. Ken, you probably know more about the various gap antennas and things of that sort that have some way of moderating what I just said. But for some of the stuff that they're doing, they're just taking your money. That's why we tell you not to buy anything significant until you've finished the course. Back to you, Bob.
Yeah, and yeah, excellent point, Jerry. When I was first became a general, I actually bought one of those things. It was said to give you what 6 meters through 80 meters, and it's essentially a big long telescoping um, uh, tubular kind of antenna, not a whip antenna. It's a long one, um, and it's got a nice big loading coil at the base of it, which is supposed to take the place of you know supposed to take the place of some length of antenna. The thing with that is I have never been able to transmit on it. I've never made a successful transmission on it. I can use it, and I do use it for shortwave listening. I can listen to shortwave broadcasts. Uh, and you know what? I haven't tried to listen to ham broadcasts. I've been listening to full AM shortwave broadcasts from other countries, and it works okay for that. But I tried transmitting on it a couple of times, tried using it like a full ham antenna, and I just couldn't get it to work. So I put it up when I want to listen to foreign stations, but other than that, yeah, it's it was not money well spent, to put it that way. Yeah.
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
you were just talking about the antenna for a car. Well, you brought up a good point. I have an all aluminum truck, which I had a problem putting lights on, so I had to get something special for my truck. What do they have for that?
Oh, I'm going to toss that one over to Jerry.
No, okay,
Crazy glue.
no, what you're gonna do, do you have any kids?
Grown up.
Okay, okay, just assume you have a little kid and you're going to do some brain surgery on the kid all by yourself. So with
That wouldn't have been the first time.
right. Okay, but
Let me point
what
out
you do,
something for them. And that is for these high frequency bands, your 2 meter, 440, etc. They're small antennas. If they're quarter wave or less, they're really small. 5/8 waves a little tougher, but um, they make these mounts that slip underneath the seam of a trunk lid. They don't hurt it at all. They're padded on the top, etc. They screw in from underneath. I've used them for years, and they're great. So there are things that you can do if you got a trunk, or if you have, let's say, a long hood.
Pickup truck.
It's well, then you can, yeah, you can come off of the hood. There are many varieties of mounts that will allow you to tie into something besides a mag mount used on aluminum, or in my case, I got a fiberglass car. Makes it even worse. I don't even get a ground plane.
right?
Is there a way you could use the radio antenna?
A radio. Say that again.
The AM FM radio antenna for a car. Is there any way that could be used?
No way.
No.
No.
No, I was going to encourage you to either do it professionally or do it yourself, is to actually drill a hole in the center of your roof. If it's a truck, you could probably get away with it a lot better than say trying to explain to the XYL why you're doing this to your car.
Yeah, but do you have a roof rack that you could attach it to? No.
Well, the roof rack would probably work as a ground plane.
They
Yeah,
do.
but if he doesn't have one.
I used to take a mag mount and a 75 meter, what they call ham stick. And when I traveled on my motorcycle out of town, I would just put the kickstand down and I put the mag mount right on the little luggage rack, as they would call it, and that worked. Now, I wouldn't be driving down the road with it, of course, not enough to hold it. But anything in that manner, a little decorative, whatever, and put a metal plate on it, and you're good to go.
And actually, you could put if you're in the shack and you want to run the radio, you can either get a baking pan or I've actually just unrolled some heavy duty tin foil or aluminum foil and use that as my ground plane, and seems to work.
Actually, Jeff, there are window mounts. Roll up your window, and I'd be pretty careful about just how much of an antenna you put on it. But for 440, that would be absolutely no problem. For 2 meters, might be a little testy on the glass, but you can shorten that antenna or get a shorter antenna, and they work. That's all I can say. They work.
Yeah. So, well, you can see you can see in this illustration here, you see the car roof, you can see the ground plane or radial wires both on the ground and then elevated up there. So that's pretty much the point that Bob's making.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and this picture is kind of points out exactly what Jerry was talking about, and that is, you've got the actual vertical antenna, but if you've got, a nice big piece of metal, whether it's a car roof or if you're using the lid of a pan, um, that acts as though it were the other half of the antenna, the other half of the dipole. Okay. Ooh,
And
where are we now?
now this is for VHF, UHF, FM.
Yes.
The protocol is to use vertical antennas when you're using FM, and horizontal antennas if you're using, say, sideband or code, which is called weak signal up there. It doesn't really matter on HF because when the signal goes from the either a horizontal dipole or a ground plane, when it bounces off the ionosphere, it it isn't oriented as or polarized as much. It's got some polarization, but not enough to really matter. So
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, that's what we were calling last week. We were calling that elliptical polarization.
Mhm.
And yeah, once it bounces off the atmosphere, it can be picked up by either a vertically polarized antenna or by a horizontally polarized antenna.
And there are
But
pluses and minuses to that, to a vertical versus horizontal. Vertical actually is probably a more effective DX antenna for long distances because, uh, well, look at it to angles and all that sort of stuff. But it picks up a lot more noise than a horizontal.
oh, okay, all right. Oh, and we've kind of covered this that a half-wave dipole is a quarter wavelength long, and for a ground plane, right? For the dipole, a half wavelength is a half wavelength long. Okay. Oh, and the rubber ducky. Oh, the much maligned rubber ducky. Yes, yes. Where have we?
Jerry, I want to say something. It wasn't long ago, in a few slides earlier, you
Mhm.
said that a vertical is nothing more than a dipole, but a dipole means two. So it's a quarter wave.
Okay, well, but it acts, it has to have the other half.
Yeah, the ground makes the other half, but it doesn't. Yeah, that's why we call them quarter waves.
Right.
You,
Mhm.
you can't call that a dipole because it's di means two. You know that, so I think it just slipped.
Okay,
I'm
well,
so confused.
okay, well,
Okay. The
okay,
rubber duck.
I won't argue with you there, but there are a couple of finer points, especially when you're going to end-fed antennas and stuff, because the end-fed is going to find its other half one way or another.
Okay. Now, the rubber ducky, you know what? They're convenient. They don't work all that well, except for very short distances, but um, but they're just really, really convenient. Now, here's a nice little rubber ducky, and you can tell that this is nowhere near a quarter wavelength for a 2 meter um, for a 2 meter band. But what it is down here in the base, it's got wound wire acting as an inductor, which kind of takes the place of some of more length. So it kind of tricks the radio into thinking it's a longer antenna than it really is. And back to our rubber ducky. That's the rubber ducky. Yeah. Oh, and a good point. It doesn't work well inside the vehicle because, well, if your vehicle is metal, it doesn't work well inside the vehicle because the metal body shields some of the signal. That's why, we like having the antennas up on the roof or on the trunk. Now, for those of you who are using non-metallic cars, it's I guess a different story. Okay, and yes, you can replace the rubber ducky. For those of you who have the little 2 meter antennas, you can replace the rubber ducky with a somewhat more efficient aftermarket antenna. Now, my rubber ducky originally came off. Nope. Where is it? Yeah. The rubber ducky originally came off this radio, but what I did is I've added an aftermarket antenna that extends. And so let me step back and show you. This really extends quite a ways. Gives me a much longer antenna. It takes a little bit of a learning curve to know how to use it well on the different frequencies, but it does increase your range a little bit.
Yeah, they're called 5/8, and Bob, you're gonna poke your eye out with it.
Yeah, and I want to point something out with that. Same kind of antenna that Bob just showed you. It'll extend out, not quite as far as Bob's. It's got a little coil in here to let it be shorter. But what I want to caution you on is when you're looking at these online, make sure you look at the connection.
Oh, yeah.
This one I bought, and I can't use it unless I throw an adapter on the radio along with it. And so unless you want to go buy adapters, which you're going to probably need anyway,
Yeah,
eventually in your ham career. But for right now, you don't want to buy the new antenna and then go, yeah, I'm ready to rock. And now, but I can't use it. Now I got to go online and find somebody who can sell me an adapter, the right adapter for it. So just be cautious of the connector that's on the antenna and the connector that's on your specific radio. They're all different. And so just have that caution.
And if you go to a ham fest, buy connectors. There's no such thing as having too few connectors.
Amen.
Although I did find that Amazon does have a fairly large stock of sellers who deal with these adapters and stuff.
Yeah,
All it takes is money.
Yeah,
That's it.
right.
that's it.
All I gotta do is call one of you guys. It sounds like you have enough.
What do you think I'm going to give you my adapters that I need? What are you
Yeah,
crazy?
just for love, because you
This is
love me.
like gold you're talking about here.
Oh man. All right. Okay. Hey, the dipole construction. There's the 490 I was thinking of. And yes. So the dipole antenna. It's quarter wavelength in each direction, met in the middle with this insulator, and then you connect one half of your coax to one side of the antenna, and you connect from your antenna or from your coax, the braid you connect to the other side of the antenna. And so what we're talking about there is, well, here's cheap wire, and this is the braid. This is the inner insulator, and this is the main cable. This one's a little easier to see. This is LMR 400, and you see the braid is here. There's the inner dielectric, and then this big piece of copper. This would connect to one side of the antenna, and this braid would to one side of the antenna, and this would connect to the other. Okay, moving right along. All right. Oh, let's go back one set. I missed. Oh, to raise resonant frequency. Yes. Now remember, to get your best reception and your best transmission, your antenna has to be resonant, meaning its capacitive reactance and its inductive reactance have to be equal. And anyhow, the way you improve the resonance is as your frequency increases, you may need to shorten your antenna, okay? To mimic the change in the
That's why you're using telescopic then.
yeah.
But with a 67-foot long antenna or a 132-foot long antenna, you can't do that.
No.
That's why we say that almost everything you do is going to be some kind of a compromise. And sometimes you're going to have to deal with the inequalities by using one of those antenna tuners. It's not the best, but it keeps your transmitter happy without blowing it up.
Mhm. Okay, so for ground plane antennas, again, what we're talking about is quarter wavelength. Okay, and so that you start with 234 divided by your frequency in megahertz. Okay, and this will give you the length in feet. Now, think about this. Think about you want to build a ground plane antenna for the 2 meter band. You want a quarter wavelength. Okay, so I take 234 and divide it by the frequency in megahertz, which is 144. And that means your quarter wavelength antenna needs to be 1 6/10 foot long, 1.6 feet. You know, about
A side, right?
18 point something inches.
18, 19 inches, something like that. Yeah. Now, Jeff, what we're talking about here is a ground plane antenna. So this is going to be the vertical piece. This is going to be the vertical piece. And then remember your roof, your roof or some other kind of metal is going to serve as the other half of that. Okay. Oh, and then they're telling you the thickness of the antenna also affects its effectiveness. Ground plane antennas, yes, they're omnidirectional. Mobile whip antennas or mount the mobile whips in the center of the roof or trunk for the best coverage. And again, here we're assuming that you've got a metal car.
Okay,
Okay, quarter wavelength is kind of normal for these things, but if you go with a 5/8 wavelength, you get a little better range because it focuses more of the signal toward the horizon. So you're
60% of the energy is transmitted at an angle about 35 degrees off the horizon. And the balance is then transmitted off at a 60-degree angle. So the takeoff angles are quite unique. One of the best antennas you can ever use for 2 meters, or actually for 440 as far as that goes.
okay.
so actually, Bob, if I can jump in too.
Sure.
Okay, the radiation from a vertical antenna is spherical, one big golf ball. If you make it at 5/8, it sort of flattens down the golf ball and extends out the range. So it's got what I think we talked about gain. I think it's So it's
Yeah.
it increases the effectiveness of the antenna. It's almost like doubling the power.
Yeah, almost like doubling the power without actually doubling the power, just focusing what power you do have. So you're not wasting power in directions you don't care about. Okay. Okay, now here we're saying at HF at high frequency, the vertical antenna is pretty darn big. Yes, at 40 meters, a quarter wavelength is 32 feet. So, you're not going to mount that on your truck. Okay. Now, we talked about this about inserting an inductor, a coil. It makes the antenna seem longer. Here we say it makes the antenna longer electrically, though not physically longer. Okay, so in putting in a coil, an inductor at the base of the antenna, it reduces the need for physical length. And again, there are some trade-offs there, but okay.
I once made a dipole out of slinkies.
Okay. Directional antenna. Last week I showed you my nice 2-meter Yagi. That's a beam antenna. The thing about those things again is since they're only going in one direction, as long as you're pointing in the direction you want, you're golden because you're getting more range. It's like you had more power, but you really don't. So, for instance, my 2-meter base radio, it can do 50 watts. Now, if I'm using a simple vertical antenna, those 50 watts goes north, south, east, and west. And if I'm really only interested in talking to someone in Detroit, which for me is south, there's a lot of wasted energy. A beam antenna would, pointed in the correct direction, would focus those whole 50 watts in a southerly direction where I want it to go. Okay. The other thing is that the beam antenna, it tends to receive best from the direction it's pointed, and in other directions that you don't care about, you'll be less bothered by other spurious kinds of transmissions and stuff that you're not interested in. Okay, and there is a nice picture of a nice Yagi. Yagi, invented in 1926 by two Japanese, I think they were physicists. One whose name was Uda, UDA, and the other whose name was Yagi. According to Wikipedia, Mr. Uda actually was the more significant character, the more significant creator, but for some reason it's named after Yagi, which
Yagi could speak English better.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, also it has kind of a cool sound to it, so Yagi. The quad antenna, that's just another directional antenna. It's another beam antenna. It does the same thing that a Yagi does.
Actually, it's better. A 2-element quad is they've had arguments for years and years. 2-element quad is just as good as a 3-element Yagi, but they're the devil in windstorms and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know what? Like Jerry says, it's always a compromise, Okay, beam antennas. Okay, for DXing, yeah, for maximum range, beam antennas are a good way to go. They can be used on UHF and VHF to avoid multipath and to bypass obstructions. Remember, we talked about trying to direct your signal, at VHF level or UHF level, to direct your signal to bounce off buildings and whatnot. That's something you can do with a beam antenna. Let's see, what else? Oh, horizontal elements for CW.
Can I ask one question?
Sure, go ahead.
It says can be used with VHF, UHF. Does that mean you could pick up TV audio?
If it's the right length.
Yeah.
Yeah, and UHF and VHF are ham radio frequency ranges. And that's more what we're talking about.
Yeah. Now the TV frequencies are in a little different part of the band. They're not in the ham bands.
Right.
So, but yeah, if your radio will dial to it, yes.
Actually, you can get some very, very interesting software-defined radios for real cheap. They're sort of like dongles that plug into your USB port. I saw something in QST magazine a couple of years back where, with the right software, you could pick up all of the aircraft that were flying around the airport, and it would even identify the each aircraft from their transponders. And I think it was a $25 or $30 dongle that you could put into your computer. It had its own antenna.
Okay. Another type of directional antenna is the beam antenna. You know, you're familiar with these dishes. Uh, now these are for very, very high frequencies for not just UHF, but for super high frequency, extreme high frequency and super high frequency. And then, you know, there are these little dishes like this. Um, this other big dish, I'm pretty sure that is not a ham radio antenna. It looks like something you would communicate with the moon with. So,
Yeah.
okay. Um, now again, these are used on radio waves with extremely short wavelengths, and the dishes themselves are normally these smaller sized things. Okay, feed lines. Cable. Oh, here we go. Now, you know what? We actually kind of talked about this last week. We talked about coax, and I showed you some different coaxes. You know, the larger, well, first off, the radio wave travels on the outside of the cable. So the larger the cable, the better transmission you get, the lower loss. When you get this real short stuff like that, you get loss, especially in the VHF range as you get further from your antenna. So as your cable gets longer and your frequency increases, you get more loss. That's when you have to go to something more substantial. Okay.
Yeah, the smaller the coaxial cable, the more it heats up at VHF, UHF frequencies.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what happens to the loss. You lose it as heat, and that heat is it's no good for you. Okay. Now the thing about coaxial cable, you've got to keep water out of it. You got to keep water um, out of the coaxial cable itself, but also out of the connections. Okay. So where are
Just gonna say, working with the phone company, I know, especially with fiber, every splice is a dB loss.
Oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
but we have this tar-like a sealant that we use. I don't know if anyone can see it. No, you
Here,
can't.
let me stop sharing a second,
Okay.
so you get a bigger
Okay.
picture.
Yeah, if anyone. Okay, it's this tar-like sealant that you can wrap around, and it's yeah, I don't know. That's my background is doing this, but
Yeah, no.
no, but that's a good
industry,
sealant,
It's
and
picking up the aurora borealis.
yeah, exactly.
some
But
people call that bishop tape.
mhm. So
Some industries call that bishop tape.
oh,
Bishop
okay,
tape.
and
That's supposed to stop dB loss, or
No,
no,
it doesn't stop dB loss. It just seals.
Yeah,
seals
when you
keeps
stretch
water.
it, it activates it, it activates it, and it turns into one big blob of plastic rubber.
Yeah.
That's actually
You have to pull it
just
first.
a blob of tar. It's not the kind of tape you're talking about. But
Oh,
and anyway, we have solutions. It's just how much money you got in your wallet to solve it.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Yeah, some common coax. RG 174. I don't know who uses that, but you know it would be relatively high loss if you get much length in it. RG 58. That's what this is. This is RG 58. You know, it's
That
okay.
hard, that hard line is only well, unless you have a pocket full of money. But we use it for our repeaters because we want maximum efficiency there. But I don't think of very many hams who actually buy hardline.
Yeah. Okay, so that's RG58. RG8X. That's a pretty common use for ham purposes. It's recommended by a lot of different people on that do YouTubes, and then but you can get up to this hardline thing, and I don't know if they refer to this as hardline. This is actually something called LMR. Let me get out of the way here. LMR 400, and it's got a great big, nice center conductor that's a nice big piece of copper.
Yeah, and I actually tried to look that up, Bob.
Yeah.
The hard line as to whether that's if they're talking about the 213 or not,
No,
or
no,
what
it's
they
not.
talking about. And it's funny because I found sites that say, yep, they're the same thing, and other sites that say, no, they are not.
They are not. No, so some of the hard line is filled with gas of certain kinds. So no,
Okay.
it's a
Like
totally different
argon
thing.
or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, yes. That hardline, very, very low loss, but it's, it's more difficult to use, right? Because as the center conductor and the diameter of the cable gets larger, it's just, more difficult to use. Okay, yeah, most coax is 50 ohms. Some is 75 ohms, but an awful lot of it is just 50 ohms. Okay, connectors. Oh, UHF connectors. Look at this. This thing up here that's called a UHF connector. I don't know why they call it UHF. It's used on HF all the time.
Yeah.
It's the most common to use in HF. It's also used in VHF.
When they developed it back around World War II, they didn't have too many options in UHF.
Okay. All right. All right. It's also referred to as SO239 and PL259.
SO for socket,
One is
PL
the
for plug.
socket and the other's the plug.
Yeah.
One is the male and one's the female. Okay. And then other really common connectors are this BNC connector when you get up into higher frequencies. The BNC connector, BNC, by the way, stands for, it's the name of three guys, Banet, Neal, and Conselman. And apparently they did that. They invented that thing. And it's a fairly common connection. It's actually, here, I just took off. It's actually on my, what I use on my handheld to connect it to the antenna. I am not. There. Okay. All right. So those are those guys. Bayonet, Neal, and Conselman. All right. And
But
then
I'm
the
gonna
end connectors.
Yeah, I want to go back real quick, Bob, and just because this was a pain spot for me when I
Okay.
was new. The so-called UHF that you have right there on your screen, the male is the SO239, the female is the PL259, and nobody else does that. So only that SO239 and PL259 have two different numbers. Everything else, there's an N male and an N female. There's a BNC male and female. There's an SMA2. So I don't know why they didn't do the 239 and have a male and a female, or a 259 and have a male and a female. I don't know why there's two different numbered connections, but don't get yourself confused. The 239 is one, the 259 is the other, male or female. and then the rest of them just having, there's an N male and an N female. So I just wanted to make that point so you don't get confused like I got in the very beginning.
Okay.
You're gonna have to blame your grandfathers or great grandfathers for that decision.
Yeah.
Well, let me bring in a couple of points here,
Okay.
which I'm going to call reality. Today, a lot of the handhelds have gotten away from the 239s.
Uh-huh.
And they started going to the BNC connectors, and now they've kind of walked away from that a little bit, and they're using the SMA connectors. So there you go, then you got it. So if you in fact are making a purchase and you anticipate going above and beyond your handheld and connecting it to some other type of antenna, make certain that you've got some type of compatibility between your coax, your additional antenna, and of course your handheld.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Back to the adapters. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
mhm.
Okay, where are we? All right, and then the end connectors. The end connectors look quite a bit different. They're not much different. This is a UHF PL259. This is the end connector, but you'll notice it's quite a bit different. You notice that? Well, I guess my
A little extra shielding in there, and I think it
yeah,
handles
a
a
little
bit more
extra
power.
shielding, but also the post in there is very tiny, whereas this has got
That's
a
a
very
sharp, tiny pin.
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. Okay.
Now, do they have adapters for one of one kind and one of another?
Oh
Oh yeah,
yeah,
you can
absolutely.
have a PL259 and you can get an adapter to go to an N with no problem at all.
yeah. In fact, this one, this is actually an adapter because this side is N, and this side is the SO239, and I use this on my antenna analyzer because its main connection is an N connection. But when I hook it up to my antennas, of course, my antennas are the UHF type, and so I have to connect it like that. Okay, back to connectors, and we're almost done here. Okay, installing connectors, soldering. Okay, soldering is a traditional way to connect coax connectors. Soldering, okay, rosin core solder. Use rosin core solder. There's a question on the exam saying what kind of solder do you not use, and it's an acid solder that you do not use. Rosin core solder is what you do.
Yeah, that's
Okay, and avoid cold.
plumbers use acid core.
I'm sorry, what?
Plumbers use acid core. You're not a plumber.
Oh, okay. I did not know that. So, but then I'm not a plumber. So anyhow, crimps are so. Oh, cold solder. A good solder joint looks smooth and shiny. So if you've got a solder joint that looks bumpy, lumpy, and rough, you've got a bad solder joint. Okay. Crimping connectors are becoming more popular. Well, I shouldn't say popular. They're being used somewhat more. All right, and waterproofing. Jerry talked about waterproofing, and yeah, it's like you need to keep you need to keep water out of your antenna system and out of the cables, and you need to take special precautions, for all those connections that are going to sit outside all year long. Okay. Um, Again, good quality electrical tape. then a layer of self-vulcanizing tape, then another covering of electrical tape. That's what's recommended. Air core cables, if you're using that, I don't know people that do use that, but if you do, you have to take special precautions. Again, because water in your line will mess up your transmission. Okay? Open feed lines. Flex, oh, what we're talking about here. Let me get to, oh. Yeah, well, all they're talking about here is just generally taking care of your feed lines, and that is, you bend them too much, and yeah, you'll actually end up breaking them. You need to avoid abrasion. Um, Rain, snow, and ice can affect your lines, and with uh, with open wire lines, though, there's generally less loss than coax, but it's kind of harder to use. Okay. And these open wire lines, they have much higher impedance. They can have impedance of 300 ohms or 450 ohms or even higher than that. And you connect that to your radio, you've got to do something in between so that it can match up with your 50 ohm radio. Okay, watt meters. Oh, we kind of talked about these things last time. Uh, Watt meters and SWR meters. Nowadays, when you buy an SWR meter, normally they come combined with watt meters. I showed you one last week that was an SWR meter, but could also, with a flip of a switch, become a directional watt meter. Antenna tuners, again, we talked about that last week also. And antenna tuners, all you're doing is matching the impedance of your cable, of your feed line to your radio. Watt meters, directional watt meters, we talked about that last week. Okay. SWR meters, okay, installed at the transmitter. Yeah, they're normally installed at the transmitter. And antenna tuners, yes, we talked about this. Ideally, you want a standing wave ratio of 1:1. You want an SWR of 1:1. You're almost never going to get it,
You're not
but
gonna get it.
you want to get as close to it as you can, and antenna tuners help you do that. Now, remember, antenna tuners, it doesn't tune your antenna like shortening your antenna or lengthening your antenna will do. All it does is it matches the impedance coming in from the feed line to the impedance at your radio. And what that does is it protects your radio from the reflected power coming back from a mismatch. Okay, and yes, they're sometimes called impedance matchers or I don't hear people calling it trans matchers anymore or match boxes. I think that's very old. Now they're just called tuners pretty much. Okay, and how to use an antenna tuner? Again, you install it between your transceiver and your antenna line. So your antenna line hooks into it, and then the antenna tuner you actually hook to your transceiver. And this talks about you adjust the impedance of the capacitance and the inductance until you get a good SWR match. A lot of the antenna tuners sold nowadays are automatic. It does it for you. My antenna tuner doesn't even have those dials on it. It's just you push a button and it searches around till it gets the best match it can. And antenna analyzers. Antenna analyzers are very cool. What the antenna analyzer does different from others is that the antenna analyzer actually sends out its own little signal. And what you do is you hook it up to your feed line and then activate it, and it will give you a reading of what your SWR is, your standing wave ratio. And from there, then you got to work with your antenna um, to get it down to an acceptable SWR. And that
Well,
is
Bob,
that.
yeah, Bob,
Yes.
as far as the antenna analyzer, it's a steep learning curve to be able to learn how to use it. But once you do, for instance, I have a beam antenna that operates on 3 bands, 20, 15, and 10 meters. And I can hook up the analyzer and it will do a sweep of all the frequencies, all the bands that my antenna operates on, and shows where the lowest SWR is for each band, all in one display. They're relatively cheap. Used to be several $100. Now I don't know. Then they had a price drop. I think I bought mine for about 30, and you can still get them for $40, $50. But as I say, it's a very steep learning curve to learn how to actually operate the thing.
Can I make a point here?
Yeah,
May I?
sure.
All right. The virtual network analyzers. This is a mistake made by so many people when they get into this right off the bat, and they say, wow, look at my SWR. I am like 1 to 1.2. I am so good to go. Oh, I can get that with a resistor. I don't need an antenna in order to see that. The additional element of getting this information is the reflection coefficient, which basically tells you where the antenna is resonant. That's your very first thing that you have to look at. You got to find out. I mean, if you make an antenna and you want to make it for 146 megahertz, and you put it together and you find it's 152 megahertz, well, you can forget the SWR because you're not going to be able to operate up there. So what we call the reflection coefficient tells us how much energy is absorbed by the antenna or used by the antenna in comparison to how much energy you're putting out. So the more energy that you put out,
Mhm.
and it's going to be a very fine part of the trace. It's like a resistor would be all the way across, but it's a very, very fine part of the trace. And Jerry, that's the first thing you probably notice, not the SWR, but you see that reflection coefficient. You go, there's the 1, there's where that's resonant. There's 2, that's where that's resonant. There's 3, that's where that's resonant. And just because they're resonant at some particular point doesn't make the SWR proper. So they could be resonant and have an impedance of 200 ohms or 300 ohms or it could be almost anything. And now it's your job to keep it resonant and start using something like a transmatch or balance that are built for 2 to 1 or 4 to 1 or 9 to 1, etc. So there are 2 pieces of information. And the first one is, where are you? And the second one is, how am I going to get my SWR down? So focusing SWR alone will get you in trouble.
Right.
Virtual
Well,
network analyzers for the price, they are quite a convenient thing. Jerry, you got yours some time ago. I think they're in the $55 to $75 at the moment.
Mhm.
Okay. And you can buy them generic or you can buy them already keyed up for analyzing antennas. And I would recommend that you do that rather than try to program it yourself.
Yes, as I say,
Fair enough. Yeah.
steep learning curve on that thing.
And if you do, look at your connectors again, because they'll come only with SMA. They might give you one little extra something, but the SMA connector is not going to tie into your PL239 or your ends. So and all of a sudden you find you got another $30 in connector. So watch it very carefully.
Mhm.
So
Of course, then the other thing, when I put my beam antenna up, Well, I had it on the ground, was on sawhorses, and I did all my measurements and stuff on there because I couldn't wait. I didn't want to buy or rent a cherry picker to go up on and adjust the thing while the antenna was 30 feet up in the air. So I did all my adjustments, hoped and prayed that the adjustments would hold when the antenna was 30 feet up, and actually it did. Got really good results. Yeah. Oh,
Okay. Um, you know what? Before I get to questions, reviewing questions for chapter 4, Jared, did you want to take any questions that there might be on chapter 3?
oh yeah. Okay. Because well, it was 2 weeks ago. I did really heavy lifting
Yeah.
on chapter 3, which covered a whole bunch of stuff. Now, wait. First of all, I tried to emphasize right the electromagnetic wave doesn't exist until it gets out of the antenna, and then when it hits another antenna, it will convert itself back into movement of electrons. And we have two types of components that were both used either electricity or electron type movement, and we also had another type of component, mostly inductors, which used magnetic fields. And I think I remember I talked about a physicist back in 1865 that found that electricity and magnetism follow the same rules. So everything worked out from there, and we were able to develop radio waves from that, thanks to Professor Dr. Hertz and Signor Marconi. Okay, one thing I didn't talk about, and it's just something to know, that a capacitor will block direct current from flowing, but if you have an alternating current, like say a voice signal or something of that sort, it will pass it through. On the other hand, an inductor, because it creates a magnetic field, when the magnetic field collapses, it creates electron flow in the opposite direction of the electricity that's flowing through it. So it blocks alternating current, but it will pass through direct current. So when we talk about power supplies and things of that sort, which we'll be doing a little late in a couple of weeks, then we use both components to help make alternating current out of the wall socket into the nice, smooth, direct current that we enjoy from batteries by using capacitors and inductors. Okay, any questions? We did a little bit on Ohm's law. I didn't have that picture. The poor little guy is being squished by Mr. Resistance from Mr. Ohm. So that's it looks like we've pretty much covered it, I guess. Everybody knows everything. Make sure that you go through the test questions, because you'll be able to pick all this stuff up a little later on. And I also just discovered why I wasn't getting very many contacts in the lower bands in 40 and 80 meters. I have two antennas. One is fairly short. It covers from 10 megahertz up to 28 megahertz. And I was using that instead of the one that's supposed to be 3.5 megahertz and up. So I just replugged it, and all of a sudden I'm hearing all sorts of signals that I didn't hear on the shorter antenna. because it was very far from resident.
ET phone home.
Absolutely. Except, yeah, I left the saw blade downstairs though. Okay, all right, we're set, I guess.
Okay,
Bob, yours.
all righty.
Oh, by the way, Bob was a drill instructor in what was the Army?
In the Army, yeah.
All right, so he's really good on regs and regulations.
Oh, but you know what? Before I do that, I want to do the, I want to take you through the questions, right? You know, this is all nice stuff we're talking about, but when you get to that exam, it's going to be specific questions. So let's look at the questions that deal with chapter 4 that we've just kind of finished up with. Okay, we'll plow through this very quickly, and we'll talk about. Stop me if you have questions, and we'll talk about any issues you need to talk about. Okay. Now remember, these are the actual kinds of questions that could appear on your exam. Okay, why do VHF signal strengths sometimes vary greatly when the antenna is moved only a few feet? And that is because multipath propagation cancels or reinforces signals. Remember, when we're talking about VHF, we're talking about very short radio waves. All right, you know, the 2 meter band. You know, you've only got a 6.5 foot radio wave, and really it can make a difference moving just a couple of feet. Also, it just makes a difference how you're holding your handheld. Remember that um, normally for VHF, for full FM, it's a vertically polarized signal. So you want to be holding your handheld so the antenna is straight up. You know, not canted to the side, not horizontal, but straight up. Okay. All right. What is the effect of vegetation on UHF and microwave signals? Okay, now remember we talked about this. We talked about during the spring, summer, early fall, when there's lots of leaves on the trees, at these very, very high frequencies, they can that vegetation can actually absorb some of your radio waves. Now, at VHF, you know, the 2 meter band, it's not so, it's much, it's very little effect. Okay, so you look at VHF 2 meters and 6 meters, very little effect. But up at VHF, you start getting up to 430 megahertz, and yes, it makes a difference. So what that also means is that during the winter, after all the leaves have fallen up here in the northern climes, that you can actually transmit a little better. When you get up to the microwave frequencies, and we haven't talked about that very much, but you know, you get up into the gigahertz range, and not only do leaves and foliage hurt you, but also fog, rain, precipitation. It can also degrade your radio transmissions. Okay, what is the meaning of the term picket fencing? Okay, now we didn't talk about this tonight, we talked about it last week. And that's that rapid flutter on mobile signals due to multipath propagation. Now remember, what's happening is if you're in a car, and remember your VHF signal, it can bounce off buildings and you get that knife edge diffraction kind of thing, and the radio waves can be received. It can be received it can be broken up and received at a little different times, and sometimes if the radio signals from two different paths are at exactly the same phase, it can come as a very, very strong signal. if they're out of phase, it can actually cancel it out. But if they're off just a little bit, then you can get increasing and decreasing, signal. Okay, what weather condition might decrease range at the microwave frequency? Okay, and remember, as you go into shorter and shorter wavelengths, the microwave frequencies, very, very high frequencies, yeah, precipitation, okay, not just vegetation, but also precipitation can decrease your range. What's the likely cause of irregular fading signals propagated by the ionosphere? Okay, and that's the rapid combining of signals arriving at different paths, right? You transmit and your signal, as it goes out, it can break up and um, bounce off buildings and arrive at its destination as more than one signal and at slightly different times, and that can be a problem. Okay, what effect does multi-path propagation have on data transmissions? And as you would expect, error rates are likely to increase, right? Um, Again, that's because your digital data is can be affected by having um, different radio signals hitting the receiver at the same time. Okay, what's the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10-meter band and the 6-meter band? All right, now remember, fog and rain, it'll hurt you up in the gigahertz range. It'll hurt you for the very, very short. But in the 10-meter band and 6-meter band, there's no effect at all. Okay. Which of the following affects the way or may allow radio signals to travel beyond obstructions and between the transmitting and receiving stations? And that's, what we talked about, knife edge diffraction. Where your radio signal is bouncing off buildings and being split. What type of propagation is responsible for over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications with ranges up to 300 miles? Yeah, that's tropospheric ducting. Remember, last week I talked about how one of the radio announcers here in the Detroit area, who's also a ham, had reported that the night before he was hearing Chicago hams transmitting, and Chicago's about 300 miles away, and they were transmitting on the 2-meter band. And normally you'd expect, well, the 2-meter band, you get, 30 miles, 50 miles, something like that. But 300 miles, wow, that's okay. So what's going on there is tropospheric ducting, some inversion in the atmosphere was just allowing the radio signals was bending the radio signals so that it could travel further than normal. Okay, and what is tropospheric ducting? That's a temperature inversion in the atmosphere. Okay, why is the radio horizon for VHF and UHF signals more distant than the visual horizon? And yeah, the atmosphere does reflect it very slightly, very slightly. The visual horizon at ground level is about 3 miles on flat ground. If you're 6 feet tall, it's again on flat ground it would be more like 5 to 8 miles, but radio waves can travel, VHF signals can travel a little further than that. Okay, which region of the atmosphere can refract and bend HF and VHF radio waves? Yeah, that's the ionosphere. Remember, last week we talked at some length about the ionosphere and the different layers of it. The D layer, the E layer, the F1 layer, the F2 layer, and we talked about how At night, the D layer goes away. The F1 and F2 layers combine into a single layer. Okay. Okay, why are simplex UHF signals rarely heard beyond their radio horizon? And yeah, UHF signals, those short wavelengths, they're not propagated by the ionosphere. They don't bounce off the atmosphere. So you're kind of stuck with, what you see is what you get. Well, it's a little better than that, but basically it's line of sight plus a little. No huge distances though. Okay, what's the characteristic of HF communications compared with communications on VHF or higher frequencies? And that is HF, and again, here we're talking HF, remember, we're talking about frequencies at really 30 megahertz and lower. All right. So long distance atmospheric propagation is much more common on HF. Okay. And what is the characteristic of VHF signals received via aurora? And you remember last week I played those two sound files for you. One of them was radio transmission off the aurora, and the other was radio transmission off meteor scatter. And the meteor scatter transmissions were really, really garbled. But so were the auroras. Not quite as bad, but it's noticeably distorted. Okay. And which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with strong signals on the 10 meter, the 6 meter, and the 2 meter bands? And that is sporadic E. And that's every now and then the E layer can extend your range in these higher frequencies, in the 6 meters and 2 meter bands. Sporadic E. And what band is most suitable for communicating via meteor scatter? Hey, this is just one of those things you just have to remember, okay? There's really no magic way to do it. It's just have to remember that when you're talking meteor scatter, you're talking 6 meter band. The 6 meter band, what megahertz is that? That's about 50 megahertz. 50 megahertz. And that, you know what, you don't need to remember a lot of frequencies for the technician exam. But one relation you really should remember is the 6 meter band at 50 megahertz. A couple of weeks ago, Jerry talked about how you calculate the wavelength by taking the frequency in megahertz, dividing it into into 300, and 300 is the speed of light in meters. All right, 300 million meters per second is the speed of light. But when we're talking about radio frequencies, and we're talking about radio frequencies in megahertz, we're talking about frequencies in millions of hertz. So that's why you can say to 300.
Bob, you're breaking up.
You see 144 megahertz, you name. Okay, that's almost 150. That's the 2 meter band. Okay, what's generally the best time for long distance on the 10 meter band? And again, just something you need to remember, from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of sunspot activity. Okay, and which of the following bands may provide long distance communication via the ionosphere's F region? Okay, now remember, we're talking about the F region, and that's a higher region in the atmosphere. It's way up there in the ionosphere, and we're talking about bending radio waves. And you remember the VHF and well, the higher VHF and certainly the UHF signals do not bounce off the ionosphere; they go right through. So the 6 meters and 10 meters is the only one that's correct here. 23 centimeters. 23 centimeters shoots right through. Oh, 23 centimeters. So let's say 70 centimeters. Yeah, because that's 70 centimeters is 430. And 430 megahertz. That shoots right through the atmosphere, right through the ionosphere. And that's handy for communicating with satellites and the International Space Station. Okay, what happens when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF and UHF line of sight link are not using the same polarization? Okay, remember at VHF and UHF, you know, it's a line of sight communication, it's a direct transmission. Polarization matters. Okay, so if the sender is using vertical polarization and the receiver is at horizontal polarization, yeah, the signal is going to be reduced somewhat. You're going to pay for that.
Isn't that something like an 18 dB loss, which is very significant?
Yeah, quite significant. It's quite significant. Okay, which of the following is a result from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? Okay. All right, so you send a vertically polarized signal up into the atmosphere, it hits the ionosphere, bounces off, it comes back as an elliptically polarized. Well, guess what? Then the guy at the other end, it doesn't matter if he's vertically polarized or horizontally polarized, that elliptically polarized signal can be received by either. All right, so that's cool. So polarization, when you're down in the HF frequencies, down below 30 megahertz, polarization doesn't matter so much. Okay, and what's the relationship between the electric and the magnetic fields of an electromagnetic wave? Yes, they are at right angles. Right angles. That was that oh, I didn't share that, did I?
Nope.
Darn it, darn it, darn it, darn it. Screen share. Of course, now I can't find it. Well,
It's in the ionosphere.
yeah. You know, this darn, well, what the heck? Okay. I had that cool picture and I tried to pull up and it just didn't work. Okay. All right. And what's the property of a radio wave? Oh, what property of a radio wave defines its polarization? Yes, remember, the polarization is determined by the orientation of the electrical field. Not the magnetic field, the electrical field. The electric field. Okay, and what are the two components? Yes, electric and magnetic fields. And what's antenna gain? Okay, now remember, we talk about antenna gain. That's the apparent increase in signal strength, although your power hasn't changed. If your radio is putting out 50 watts on a vertical antenna, if you switch to a Yagi, a directional antenna, you're going to get much more distance, but you're still just using 50 watts. All you're getting is 50 watts. But compared to other antennas, it seems like you have more power. You don't, but it seems like it. Okay. All right. Hey, do you remember I told you last week, I want you to remember whenever we talk about decibels, and this is just for the test, just for the technician test, I want you to remember three numbers. The three numbers I want you to remember are 3 decibels, 10 decibels, and -6 decibels. Okay? 3, -6, and 10. Okay? Because there's only because we don't really have the time to go through and explain logarithms to you and all that bit. And for most of us, we haven't used logarithms since high school. And for me, that's 60 years ago. So, any rate, so let's work on this. What decibel value most closely represents a power increase from 5 watts to 10 watts? Okay, this is a doubling of power. And the answer there is 3 decibels. And if you took, I worked this out, and it's something like 2.4 or 2.3, 2.3 times 2.3 times 2.3. I think that's it. That comes out to 10. Okay, so it's not really quite 3, but it's close to 3. Anyhow, so that's that one. Here's the next one.
3.01.
3.01. There you go. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. The next one. What represents a power decrease from 12 watts to 3 watts? And that is -6 decibels. Okay. Now, here's the thing I want you to see in this. Of those 3 numbers I told you to remember, +3, +10, -6, the only one showing up here is -6, right? So pray that this shows up on your test because you know the answer. All right, the next one.
Oh, Bob,
Hello.
back up a slide. If you would.
Yes.
Okay, interestingly, 3 dB was 2 times, 6 dB is 4 times. Do you see
Yes.
that? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the beauty of logarithms.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I didn't think about that, but yes. Okay. All right. The next one.
6.02 instead
Now.
of 3.01.
Okay. Now, here we have, of those 3 numbers, +3, -6, or +10. Do you see any of those in this in this list of possible answers? Yes, you do. Which decibel value represents an increase from 20 watts to 200 watts? And that's 10 decibels. Okay, so this one again should be easy. You remember those 3 numbers? This one should be easy. This one, you'll notice actually this has 2 of those numbers. It's got 3 decibels and 10 decibels, but you're just doubling it. So go with the 3 decibels. Got it? Okay. What happens to power lost in feed lines? Oh, the power lost is converted to heat. Yeah. Yeah, that's why your radio heats up. It's got resistors, and the resistors take some of the power and turn it into heat. And some of those other components do also. But yeah, power lost in the feed line is converted to heat. Okay, and what's the most common impedance of coaxial cables? Coax cables are most commonly 50 ohms. Just remember that, 50 ohms. Okay, and why is coaxial cable the most common feed line for amateur radio? Hey, because it's just easy to use. It's easy to use. You can run it along gutters because it's insulated, and so being next to other metal doesn't hurt it. and it's quite durable, quite durable. So, okay, and what happens to the frequency of a signal in coaxial? What happens as the frequency of a signal is increased? And as the frequency increases, the loss increases. Okay. Now you remember how we were talking about, in the higher frequencies, you need to use the bigger wire, the bigger cable, to prevent or to minimize your signal losses. Okay. And which of the following feed lines has the lowest loss? Okay, air insulated hard line. Yes, it has the lowest loss at VHF and UHF frequencies. It's also pretty expensive. It's kind of hard to work with, but it's very efficient. Okay, and which of the following should be considered when selecting an accessory SWR meter? The frequency and the power levels at which measurements will be made. Okay. All right. And what reading on an SWR meter, a standing wave ratio meter, indicates a perfect impedance match between antenna and feed line? And that's a 1-to-1. You won't often get it, but that's the ideal. And what do most solid state transmitters, oh, I'm sorry, why? Why do most solid state transmitters reduce output power as SWR increases beyond a certain level? And that's to protect your transceiver, to protect the output amplifier transistors in your transceiver. Because what the increase in SWR means is that some of that power that you're pushing out to your antenna is being reflected back, and it's coming back in the direction of your transceiver. And your transceiver does not like this. Okay, and what does an SWR reading of 4-to-1 indicate? That's a big mismatch. Got it? Okay, and what's the benefit of a low SWR? Yes, reduced signal loss. Reduced television interference? No. Less antenna wear? Well, I don't know about that, but the big thing is it's reduced signal loss. Okay, and what can cause erratic changes? Okay, we talked about, you need to have good connections in your antenna and your feed line, including, keeping it dry, keeping the water out, but even just a loose connection can mess up your transmission. Okay, and what is the standing wave ratio? And it's a measure of the load match between the transmission line, along the transmission line. Okay, which of the following describes a type of antenna loading? Okay, and we talked about this before as using a coil to serve as part of the antenna, to allow you to use shorter antenna lengths. Okay, so electrical lengthening, and that's what they're talking about, is that instead of having a super long antenna, you've got an antenna and you've got a coil in it acting as though it's part of the length of the antenna. Okay, and which of the following describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to the Earth's surface? Well, okay, it's a horizontally polarized antenna. Big deal. Okay, what's the disadvantage of the short flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radios compared with a larger antenna? And it's lower efficiency. Here they're talking about the rubber ducky. And the rubber ducky, it's convenient, but it's not very efficient. And which of the, how are we doing on time? We're doing good. Okay, which of the following increases the resonant frequency of a dipole? Okay, remember, As the frequency increases, the radio wave shortens. So your antenna, you would want to shorten your antenna as frequency increases. Okay, and what's the disadvantage of using a handheld VHF transceiver with a flexible antenna inside of a vehicle? And as we talked about, using it inside a vehicle, your signal strength is reduced because the metal vehicle will shield some of the radio signal. Okay, and the approximate wavelength of a quarter wave vertical antenna. Yeah, it's about 19 inches, right? Because remember, a full wavelength would be about 66 inches, so about a fourth of that is about 19 inches. That's the closest number you get to it. Okay, and the approximate length in inches of a half wave 6-meter dipole, half wave, okay, 112 inches. In which direction does the half wave dipole radiate its strongest signals? Okay, dipole antennas, remember we talked about that, and it radiates its signals not off the ends, but broadside to the antenna. It's radiating it off the sides. And what's the advantage of a 5/8 wave whip antenna for VHF or mobile services? And that is it has more gain than a quarter wavelength. Remember, now this is what Jerry was telling you. Jerry was telling you that, you know, if you take that quarter wavelength and increase it to 5/8 of a wavelength, instead of getting that golf ball sized transmission pattern, radiation pattern, it like flattens the top of it, you know, because the transmission going straight up is of no good to you, okay? You want it going out, so you flatten the top of that, it puts more power out to the sides. Okay, and what antenna polarization is used for long distance CW and single sideband contacts on VHF and UHF? Okay, we talked about this last week a little bit, and that is if you're doing full FM on VHF, normally you're going to use vertical polarization. But if instead of using full FM, you want to use single sideband, or you want to do just Morse code, then horizontal polarization will get you better distance. Okay, and when using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to communicate with a distant repeater if a building or obstructions are blocking its line of path, its line of sight path? And that, you know, we talked about, you know, trying to reflect your signals, which works very well in the VHF area. It reflects your signal around to get to that other receiver. Okay, you want to reflect your signal off buildings or whatever. Okay, what's a beam antenna? Yep, we talked about that. Concentrates its signal in one direction. Okay, and what type of antenna offers the greatest gain? The greatest gain. And that, of course, is a Yagi. Now, a J-pole is like a ground wave antenna. Those are normally used like in the 2-meter band. And it's like a quarter wavelength up, and you know it's radiating off the side, so it's like an omnidirectional antenna. The 5/8 wave is a little better. As we've just talked about, the isotropic antenna does not exist. The isotropic antenna is a theoretical construct. That's if you could have an antenna that was a single point in space. And that's what, when talking about gain is sometimes compared to what you would get from an isotropic antenna. Okay, it doesn't really exist. So, and since it's the isotropic offers no gain. Okay, which of the following causes failure in coaxial cable? And moisture contamination. Yeah, we've talked about that. We've beaten that to death. And why should the outer jacket of coax be resistant to ultraviolet light? Because it's going to be out in the out in the sunlight for a long time. Okay, ultraviolet can damage the jacket, and if the jacket gets damaged, then yeah, then water can get in.
So can squirrels do a lot of damage to cable. They gnaw on it for teeth. They really do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
One thing, Bob. The modern coax cables are pretty resistant to light, and they make them for direct burial. So you can just dig a trench and bury them without having to put them in conduits or anything like that.
Okay. And what's the disadvantage of air core coaxial cable when compared to foam or solid dielectric types? And you have to take special pains to keep moisture out of that cable. All right. And oh, and I told you, oh, and as Jerry commented, acid core solder is used by plumbers, not ham radio operators. Okay. Um, Rosin core solder is very, very common. I'm not sure about the other two, but rosin core is very common for ham radio applications, but acid core should not be used. Okay, and what's the characteristics, appearance of a cold? And when they say a cold solder, they're talking about a bad one. All right, and that's a rough or lumpy surface. A good solder that has good connection should look shiny and smooth. Okay, and which of the following RF connectors is most suitable for frequency above 400 megahertz? And that's the type N connector. Uh, I don't know if we talked about that. We talked about type Ns, but yeah, they're more common at the UHF frequencies. Okay, and what type? Oh, which of the following is true of the PL259 coax connectors? And yes, they are commonly used at HF and VHF frequencies, even though they're sometimes referred to as UHF connectors. No, they're common at HF and VHF. Okay, which of the following is a source of loss in coax feed line? And this is one of the few times where the correct answer is going to be all of the above. Water intrusion into connectors, yeah, that's bad. So is high standing wave ratio. And then multiple connectors in the line, yeah, every time you have another connector in the line, you have some loss. So yeah, all of those are correct. And let's see, all right, we're getting, okay. What is the electrical difference between RG58 and 213? And RG213, it's a wider cable, it's a thicker cable, and it has less loss at any given frequency than the RG58. Okay, and where should the RF power meter be installed? And that's in the feed line between the transmitter and the antenna. Yeah. Which of the following is used to determine that the antenna is resonant? An antenna analyzer. Yeah. What instrument can be used to determine SWR other than an SWR meter? A directional watt meter. And a directional watt meter, what that does is it measures forward power and it measures reflected power. And you can calculate the SWR from those two numbers. Okay, and what is the major function of an antenna tuner? And that is simply, remember this, it matches impedance. It doesn't really tune the antenna like shortening or lengthening the antenna would. All it does is it matches the impedance of your transceiver to your antenna system. And that's that. Those are the questions that you could, screen sharing is closed. Yes, okay. Those are all the questions relating to chapter 4. And if you are feeling confident about that, then we're good. Okay. I didn't think the rest of chapter 4 would take this long, but we're just about 6 minutes away from 9 o'clock, so I think that's going to be it for tonight. Unless anyone have questions?
Well, I did
We're
the
gonna
line.
do chapter
Yes.
5 next week or
Okay.
7?
Uh,
Okay, next week is going to be Mike, and Mike is going to be doing chapter 6.
6.
And then the week after that, Jerry is going to do chapter 5.
Okay, I have
And we
exams
had to do
next
that
week.
because Jerry's not going to be with us next week.
Yeah. Looks like I've got a whole bunch of extra class wannabes that are coming next Tuesday.
Oh, great.
Yeah, actually, we just covered exactly what you were covering, line impedances and so on. That's kind of interesting. First and foremost, nice job tonight, guys. I hope everybody walks away with something. These instructors definitely should get a round of applause for what they did tonight. So there you go. Take a bow, guys.
Give
And,
the applause. Give me a
And
beer.
for the rest of you who stayed awake through the whole thing, you should take a bow too. So,
Yes, absolutely.
That's
All
the
right.
more
Well,
important one, yeah.
hopefully we'll see you next Tuesday. 73, boys.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care, Kenny.
All right. All right. Thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Have a
it.
good night.
Good night.
Take care, guys. Be well.
Okay. Let's see more. Stop.
Mike, are you